Welcome to the third video in our tutorial series on working with our pixel mapping software. In the last video we talked about DMX configuration. This time around we're going to talk about actually using the system the way that you would use it for controlling an actual show. So we'll be going back and forth between lighting console control and controlling through the pixel mapping software, just so that you can see how this all works. So if you've been following along so far, you will have noticed that the rig that we're working with for the pixel rig here is a little bit different than what we've seen so far. This is just taking the techniques that we've talked about so far in this series and expanding it out a little bit so that we have something a little more visually interesting to work with as we play with the pixels here. So let's go ahead and dive into this a little bit. I'm going to go and switch to my lighting console here, and I'm just going to turn on the first layer of all of the fixtures that we've got going here. And this is going to be very familiar from what we've been doing throughout this whole series. So this is the pixel range effect, and I'm just adjusting the end pixel on this, and it does exactly what we've been doing so far. So let's go ahead and branch out into something a little bit more interesting here. Let's look at some of the other effects. So I'm going to go ahead and disable DMX input for just a second here so that I can show you how changing effects works. So if we're looking at, let me just go ahead and select all of the fixtures here. If we're looking at which effect that we're wanting to do and wanting to change to a different effect, we can change it by changing graph selection here. And so if I go ahead and change this value, I'm going to have to bring the rate up. I've moved to a different effect here, and we can see the title of this effect is random. If I move forward, we got sign chase, rectangular mask, pinwheel, Z chase, so on and so forth. So by changing this graph selection value, you can change which effect you're on. And then by changing the other parameters, we can change how this effect looks. And it's kind of the beauty of the procedural system that we've got here. And you'll see this more as we go on. We've got a series of effects, and they all have different parameters, and you can create a whole bunch of different looks by just modifying the parameters. Okay, so let me go ahead and hop back to lighting console control here. And let's look at something that's a little more interesting. So I'm going to hop to the ripple effect. And this is just a basic setup for the ripple effect. And if we look down here at the parameters, we can see that there's more here than we've been dealing with so far. So we've got translate X, Y, and Z, scale X, Y, and Z, some colors, intensity, and then modifier A, B, C, and rate. So let's go ahead and go through each one of these to see what it does for this particular effect. So I'm going to go ahead and adjust my translate X and Y position. And so this is just mapped to pan and tilt on my console. So I can move the center point of this effect around wherever I want it to be, which is really fun. I can also do this individually for each fixture. So right now I've been controlling this by taking every fixture and setting it to this same value. I'm going to go ahead and grab the second fixture and move its center point to be different than the first one, and then I'll grab the third fixture, move its center point, and the fourth fixture. And then just to make this even, I'm going to take the LED, the lines that are on the top and the bottom. I'm just going to center these so that it's all hanging out right in the center there. Okay, and as I've done this, you see that the effect details panel has expanded. So instead of having one single row where it's telling me what everything is doing, it's noticed that we still just used this this ripple effect, but we have different parameters set on different fixtures. So it's broken things out based on what can't be combined together because the values are identical. So if you look at this bottom row, we can see it's got two fixtures. It's the top and bottom lines here because they are, like, the values set on them are identical, so it's just going to collapse them down and make it a little bit cleaner. But everything else, it's expanded out. All right, so that's translate X and Y. We will look at translate Z in just a minute here because we have to work with scale a little bit before that's going to do anything for us. So let's look at what scale is going to do. So let me select all of these fixtures again. And I'm just going to center them so that everything goes back to 1. And then we can adjust the X scaling. So we can make this wider. And we can take it down to the point where the scale is set to 0 and we're just getting lines, which is kind of an interesting look. We can adjust Y scaling and do the same thing with that. And we can also adjust Z scaling. So if I go ahead and adjust the Z depth, you'll notice that something interesting has happened, and it may not make perfect sense as you're looking at this. But one of the things that we haven't covered so far in this series is the fact that even though we've been laying everything out in 2 dimensions so far, this is actually a 3-dimensional system. So if I use the number pad here and switch to a side view, you can see that these are actually laid out with some Z depth to them. So it's not just flat, these are going back into the scene, and the effects take that into account. So this effect is moving from the front to the back of this the scene, and we'll look at some other effects in just a minute here that will showcase that a little bit more. It's a little hard to see on this, but now that we have some Z depth, we can adjust the Z position of this. So now we're moving, instead of it being like all the way forward in our scene where the center point of this effect is, we're moving it halfway back to the scene, which puts it at the center of the panels. So with this particular effect on this rig, doesn't do a whole lot, but it will become more important as we move on here. So I'm going to go ahead and take the Z scale back to 0 just to make this a little bit easier to understand as we go through some of this. And let's go ahead and adjust color, because that's the next thing that we've got going. So color should make perfect sense. We're just adjusting the color values on all of the fixtures. Intensity we've used before, and then we will get into a little bit more interesting stuff here as we go into the modifiers. So modifier A in this, if we look at the value here, is frequency. So if I bring this up, it's actually adjusting how many rings are happening on here, which, because pixel screens like this tend to be fairly low density, you wind up with kind of interference patterns happening, which can create some really interesting stuff. It's still the same ripple effect, it's just more dense. So I'm going to take that back to 0. Next thing we've got is fall off. So if I adjust this to 0, you'll see that I have kind of this sine wave pattern happening as it moves out here. And fall off adjusts the amount, basically the steepness of that waveform, so that it makes it so the peaks and valleys are either steeper or shallower. And then if we look at modifier C, we can see that's direction. So if I take this to 0, it starts moving the opposite direction. So yeah, and then rate is just going to be the speed of this effect. So I can speed it up, slow it down, make whatever I want to have happen. The cool thing about procedural effects like this is, because it's all being generated on the fly, if we bring the rate down, it doesn't decrease the smoothness of the effect. So if we were using this to play back video sequences and adjusting the rate on that, which we can do and I will show you in a future tutorial, what will happen as we get slower is it's going to get, like, the frame rate will get lower and lower, because there are only so many frames that it can that the video source has, and as it gets slower, it's basically holding on each frame for longer. With procedural systems, it's generating this all on the fly, so if I slow it down, it's still going to output at the same constant rate that it's been outputting at, which is very, very helpful. So that covers all of the parameters in this particular effect. Let's go ahead and look at a noise texture here. So I'm just going to go ahead and release all of this, make that go away. And let's bring up billow noise. 1 second, let me select the right thing here. And okay, billow noise. So this is a noise texture, and this actually has quite a few parameters on it. And with most of this stuff, I'm not going to go into great detail on these effects right now, because there's so many of them with so many different parameters. You kind of just have to play around with it and figure out what looks you like, how it works with your rig. What I want you to get out of this right now is just how to play around with it, what is possible. So we've got this this effect right now. I'm going to go ahead and just kind of adjust some of the parameters to play around with it. So we've got frequency, modifier, yeah, B, C, D. We can get some different things out of it. So this is very similar to what we were doing before. Same with scaling it. I can scale X, Y, Z. Another thing that we haven't seen yet is the ability to rotate. So I can rotate this on the Z-axis, Y-axis, and X-axis and get different looks out of it based on that. So let's look at combining two different layers together. So we'll keep this happening on layer 1, and let's go ahead and use a Z chase on layer 2. So I'm going to select layer 2 here, and I'm going to go ahead and turn Z chase on. Okay, so now we've got two different effects running at the same time, one on layer 1, one on layer 2. And these currently are just being blended with highest takes precedence. So whichever value is higher, it's going to display that. What we need to do to make this more interesting here is adjust the blending mode. So I'm going to go ahead and change through the blending modes here using the blending mode parameter. Actually, let me, since this is not displayed in effect details, let me disable the input again, and let me just adjust through blending modes here. Okay, so to begin with, we have highest takes precedence. Second, we have additive, which doesn't show up in this because it's just straight white, but it's going to add the values from the first layer to the second layer. The third one we have is subtractive. So you can see the values from the second layer are being subtracted from the first layer. So this Z chase that we have is being subtracted from the first layer. Then we have difference, which is basically kind of giving the inverse value of what's there. It's a little bit more complex than that, but I don't need to go into it right now. Then after that, we have multiply. So what multiply is going to do is it's going to multiply the values of the first channel by the second channel, which in this case, since the second channel or second layer has the Z chase where everything is black except for that strip that's going up through it, all of the values that are black are going to make the background layer black. The values that are white are going to make the background layer visible. So this lets us do some interesting things with this. So let's switch to something that we can make kind of a more pleasing effect with. So let's go ahead and set ripple on. Oh, let me go ahead and switch this back to console control. Okay, let's go ahead and set up a look here. So I'm going to go ahead and change this to multiply. I'm going to adjust our scaling on this effect. And now you can see we've got this ripple revealing the background layer, which kind of gives a more interesting organic feel to this. Let's go ahead and set color on this. And yeah, so that's kind of interesting. Another thing that we can do is we can use the lighting console to run its own effects on this system as well. So instead of just using the effects built into the pixel mapping system, you can combine them with the effects from the lighting console. So build an effect that's driving the scale on this, and you get something like this happening. Which let me turn off the blending mode for a second. And so yeah, we can do something like that, which is fairly cheesy, but it could be used to create something a lot more interesting given a little bit of time playing with it. So I think that kind of covers the basics of working with this system. And what I would say is just spend time playing with the different effects that you've got. Spend some time trying to just wrap your head around what all of the different parameters do on all of the different effects. Use the effect details panel to see what everything is doing, and it becomes a very powerful system for building all sorts of different looks and driving it all. In the next video, we'll take a look at using video content and streaming content through the Pixel Rig.